Hi, this is Lee from the Law School Toolbox and the Bar Exam Toolbox. Today, we are diving into crimes against the person, specifically assault, battery, false imprisonment, and kidnapping. We will walk through the elements of each crime and use examples to illustrate how these crimes may appear and interact on the bar exam or your law school exams. So let's start with assault and battery. Though these terms are often used together, they're actually two distinct crimes. An assault is an act that creates a reasonable apprehension of an immediate harm or offensive contact. Battery, on the other hand, is the actual contact or the harmful or offensive touching of another person. Think of assault as putting someone in fear of being hurt or touched offensively, while battery is actually hurting or touching them. Now that we have distinguished these crimes, let's break down the elements of each, starting with assault. An assault is 1. An intentional act, 2. That causes the victim to be placed in reasonable apprehension, 3. Of an imminent harm or offensive contact with the victim's person. By intentional, we mean that the defendant acted either A. with the purpose of causing such apprehension, or B. with the knowledge to a substantial certainty that the apprehension will result. Additionally, if a defendant attempts a battery but fails to make contact, this may constitute an assault if the victim reasonably fears the attempted contact. So now let's walk through the elements of battery. A battery is 1. The unlawful application of force, 2. Directly or indirectly upon another person or their close personal belongings, and 3. That results in an injury or offensive contact. Here is the key distinction. Battery requires contact or the application of force. For assault, no contact is necessary. This is why an attempted battery usually results in an assault. For example, if I swing a punch at you and miss, that's an assault as long as you reasonably feared I was about to hit you. On the other hand, the missed punch is not a battery because there's no actual contact or unlawful application of force. One final note on battery. Notice that the application of force may be direct or indirect. An example of the indirect application of force is throwing something heavy, like a rock, at another person. If the rock hits the other person, this is a battery. If the rock misses, this is likely an assault, but it is not a battery because there is no contact. That wraps up the basics of assault and battery. Let's move on to our second set of related crimes against the person: false imprisonment and kidnapping. As with assault and battery, there is some overlap between these crimes. However, there is also a key distinction. We will highlight that distinction as we walk through the elements of each, starting with false imprisonment. False imprisonment occurs when one person intentionally restricts another's freedom of movement without consent or legal justification. False imprisonment requires 1. The unlawful, 2. Confinement of a person, 3. Against their will, and 4. With knowledge that the confinement is unlawful. By confinement, we mean that the victim has no reasonable means of escaping the restraint. Kidnapping has similar requirements to false imprisonment. However, it usually requires an additional element: transporting or moving the victim. This transporting or moving of the victim is called asportation. So a kidnapping is 1. The intentional, and 2. Unlawful confinement, and 3. Movement of a person against their will. Some jurisdictions also require that the movement must be accomplished by force, threat of force, or fraud. So let's work through a hypothetical that will help us understand how these crimes against the person play out in real-world situations. Here's our scenario. Dave is angry at his coworker Pete for getting a promotion Dave wanted. One day in the office parking lot, Dave sees Pete getting into his car. Dave picks up a rock and starts walking quickly toward Pete with the rock raised over his head. Pete sees Dave coming and, frightened, quickly gets into his car and locks the doors. Dave then throws the rock, but hits Pete's car window instead of Pete. Frustrated, Dave stands behind Pete's car, refusing to move and preventing Pete from backing out of the parking space for about 15 minutes until security arrives. So let's analyze what crimes Dave may have committed. We have several issues to explore here. First issue, did Dave commit assault when he approached Pete with the rock? As a reminder, assault requires 1, an intentional act, 2, that causes the victim to be placed in reasonable apprehension, 3, of an imminent harmful or offensive contact with the victim's person. Analyzing these elements, Dave intentionally acted when he approached Pete with the rock, because Dave, at the very least, knew how this act of approaching Pete with a rock over his head will result in Pete having a reasonable apprehension of an imminent harmful contact. And Pete was placed in this reasonable apprehension because he appeared frightened, quickly jumping into the car and locking the doors. Additionally, Dave approaching Pete with the rock certainly appears capable of causing an imminent harmful contact. Therefore, Dave committed assault when he approached Pete with the rock. Second issue, did Dave commit battery when the rock hit Pete's car? To review, a battery is 1, the unlawful application of force, 2, directly or indirectly upon another person or their close personal belongings, that 3, results in an injury or offensive contact. Here, although Dave intended harmful contact with Pete, he missed and hit the car instead. No battery occurred because there was no actual contact with Pete's person. However, Dave likely committed a property crime by damaging the car. Third issue, did Dave commit false imprisonment by blocking Pete's car? False imprisonment requires 1, the unlawful, 2, confinement of a person, 3, against their will, and 4, with knowledge that the confinement is unlawful. By confinement, we mean that the victim has no reasonable means of escaping the restraint. Analyzing these facts, Dave clearly acted to confine Pete by blocking his car. This confinement is unlawful because it is not legal to intentionally block a driver in a parking space. Additionally, this confinement is against Pete's will because Pete has not consented to the confinement. However, was the confinement sufficient for false imprisonment? Meaning, did Pete have a reasonable means of escaping the confinement? While Pete could have potentially gotten out of his car and walked away, though that might have put him at risk of attack from Dave. This is a closer call, but Dave probably did commit false imprisonment. Even though Pete could theoretically have left his car, courts generally hold that victims aren't required to risk harm to escape confinement. So there are likely sufficient facts here to establish that Dave committed false imprisonment. But what about kidnapping? Here, the elements of kidnapping are not satisfied because Dave has not moved or transported Pete. Therefore, while Dave may have committed false imprisonment, he is unlikely guilty of kidnapping. So that concludes the first part of our discussion on crimes against the person. In our next episode, we'll continue exploring these concepts with more complex scenarios involving potential assault, battery, false imprisonment, and kidnapping. We'll analyze situations where the line between these crimes becomes blurrier and examine how these offenses can escalate from one to another. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe, give us a like, and leave us a comment, and check out barexamtoolbox.com and lawschooltoolbox.com for more.